My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not a wealthy man, not by any stretch. But I was careful. Dorothy and I, my wife, she passed 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. We were always careful. We drove used cars. We packed lunches. We took one real vacation every 5 years. We paid off our mortgage 11 years before the bank expected us to. We had a modest lake house in rural Indiana that her father had left her when he died, and we'd renovated it slowly, one summer at a time, doing most of the work ourselves. Dorothy and I had one child. Our daughter, Melissa. She is the best thing we ever made. Smart, kind, stubborn in all the right ways. She got her mother's laugh and my inability to back down when she believes something is right. She married a man named Brandon when she was 28. I walked her down the aisle. I gave the toast at the reception. I genuinely liked him then. I want to be clear about that. I liked Brandon. He was charming and confident, and he made my daughter light up in a way that made everything else feel secondary. He had big ideas, which I respected, even when some of those ideas made me uneasy. He'd started 2 businesses by the time he was 30. One had dissolved quietly. The other was still limping along, selling custom cabinetry online. He talked about it the way a man talks about a horse he knows isn't going to win but refuses to put down. Dorothy saw things in Brandon that I chose not to. She'd say, gently, after holidays, when he dominated dinner conversation with his projections and his pitches, she'd say, "Walter, that man measures love in square footage." I'd tell her she was being unfair. She'd give me that look she had, patient and sad, like she was watching something take longer to fall than physics should allow. She was right. Of course, she usually was. After Dorothy died, Melissa became the center of my world. Not in a way I burdened her with. I was careful about that. I kept busy. I took on consulting work. I volunteered at a literacy program 2 mornings a week. I had friends, old colleagues, a neighbor named Gerald who came over on Fridays to watch whatever game was on. I was managing, but Melissa and I talked on the phone 3 or 4 times a week, and once a month I'd drive down to their place in Cincinnati for the weekend. Those visits kept me grounded. They reminded me what I was still here for. Brandon, during those visits, had started to change toward me. Or maybe he'd always been this way, and Dorothy's presence had kept it in check, the way a thermostat keeps a room from going extreme. Without her, the temperature shifted. He'd started making small comments about the lake house sitting empty most of the year, about how I'd mentioned, once, that my financial advisor had done well with the portfolio Dorothy and I had built over 30 years, about how anyone with real assets should be thinking about putting them to work rather than letting them sit. I didn't react to these comments directly. I was raised not to. My father had a saying, "Let a fool talk long enough, and he'll explain himself completely." So I listened. I nodded. I changed the subject. And I started paying closer attention. The first real sign came 8 months ago. Melissa called on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual. We typically talked on Sunday mornings. She sounded careful, like she'd rehearsed what she was going to say. She told me Brandon's cabinetry business needed an influx of capital, that they'd talked to 2 banks and been turned down, that Brandon had a plan, a real plan this time, to expand into commercial contracts, restaurants, hotels, office renovations. She said the number they needed was $380,000. She said, and I could hear how much it cost her to say it, that they were hoping I'd consider it as an investment. I didn't answer right away. I asked her a few questions. Where was the business plan? Had they shown it to anyone besides the banks? What specifically had the banks said when they declined? Her answers were vague in the way that told me she either didn't know or hadn't been told. I said I'd think about it. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already been thinking about it, because Brandon had called me himself 2 days before, when Melissa was at her book club. He hadn't framed it as a request. He'd framed it as an opportunity. He told me, in a voice that was friendly but had something underneath it, something that reminded me of a hand resting on a table near a contract, that I should think about what I wanted my legacy to look like, that the lake house was a depreciating asset if it wasn't generating income, that Dorothy would have wanted the family to be secure. That last part. That's the part I keep coming back to. He said Dorothy's name. He said she would have wanted this. Dorothy would have been on the phone to her sister within 30 seconds of hanging up with him. I didn't sleep well that week. Not because I was afraid or angry, though I was both, but because I was calculating. I've spent my whole career in engineering, and one thing you learn early is that a structure reveals its flaws under load. You don't see what something is actually made of until you put weight on it. Brandon had just told me, without meaning to, exactly what he was made of. I called my attorney, a man named Dennis I'd been working with since Dorothy, and I bought the lake house he'd done, our wills, our trust documents, all of it. I drove to his office that Thursday, and I sat across from him, and I laid out everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about Dennis. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, what do you want to happen here?" I told him. And we started making arrangements. Over the next 6 weeks, I restructured. It wasn't complicated, but it required precision. And Dennis and I worked through it carefully. The lake house, Dorothy's lake house, the one her father built in the 1970s on 2 acres of Indiana shoreline, was transferred into a charitable remainder trust. The investment portfolio, the one Dorothy and I had spent 3 decades building, was reorganized, with specific designations and protections. My primary residence in Columbus, the house where Melissa had grown up, where Dorothy had planted a garden in the backyard that still bloomed every spring without anyone tending it, that I listed quietly with a realtor I'd used years before. I want to be honest about something. This wasn't easy. There were nights I sat in that house and second-guessed everything. I'd look at the chair Dorothy used to sit in when she read, and I'd wonder if I was being too hard, too cold, too calculated. I'd wonder if Brandon might genuinely come through, if maybe I was the one being unfair, doing exactly what I'd accused Dorothy of when she'd made her careful observations about him. But then I'd remember the way he'd used her name. And I'd remember that Melissa had called me 2 days after Brandon had called me separately, and she hadn't mentioned that he'd already reached out. And I'd remember the voice he'd used. Friendly. Patient. Like a man who'd already decided the answer was yes, and was just waiting for me to catch up. I sold the Columbus house in 22 days. Faster than I expected. I found a small rental in a town called Millbrook, about 40 minutes north, a place I'd driven through a few times, and always thought looked quiet in the right way. I arranged movers for a Thursday, which is when I knew Melissa and Brandon would both be at work. I didn't take everything. I took what was mine, what felt like me. Dorothy's garden I couldn't take, but I cut a few stems from the rose bushes she'd planted the year Melissa was born and brought them in a jar of water. I'd find somewhere to plant them eventually. On the Wednesday before I moved, I wrote a letter. 2 copies, one for Melissa, one for Brandon, in separate envelopes, both addressed by hand. Brandon's I left in the mailbox of the Columbus house. Melissa's I mailed to her work address, because I knew she'd see it before he did. And that mattered. I was 40 minutes outside Columbus when Brandon called my phone. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times over the next 2 hours. The messages started professional and ended in a register. I won't repeat here, but I'll say they told me everything I'd suspected about the man beneath the charm. Melissa called that evening. Her voice was different from any version of it I'd heard before, not angry, not exactly. Stunned. Like someone had shifted the furniture and she was moving through a familiar room in the dark. She'd read her letter. She asked me why. I told her that wasn't quite the right question. I asked her if she'd known about Brandon's separate call to me. There was silence. Then she said, quietly, "No. We talked for 2 hours that night. I want to be clear. I never said a harsh word about Brandon. That wasn't the purpose of the letter. And it wasn't the purpose of the call. I told her what I'd observed, what I'd felt, what I'd decided. I told her that I loved her without condition and that nothing I'd done changed that by a single degree. I told her that what I'd arranged with Dennis meant that the assets Dorothy and I had built over a lifetime were protected for her. Eventually, through the structure of the trust, in a way that was deliberate and careful and couldn't be accessed by pressure or by leveraging grief. She didn't agree with me that night. I didn't expect her to. She was hurt, and her hurt made sense. I'd moved without warning. I'd changed things without asking her permission. She felt, I think, like the ground had shifted under her life and she hadn't been consulted. I understood that. I told her I understood it. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, just somewhere different. What I hadn't accounted for, in all my careful planning, was the month that followed. Brandon's response to the letter was to lawyer up. He'd apparently consulted someone about whether my restructuring could be contested on the grounds of, and I had to read Dennis's summary twice before it fully landed elder financial incapacity. He was arguing, through his attorney, that my decisions had been made under emotional distress following Dorothy's death and therefore weren't sound. Dennis found this position creative in the way that a house fire is creative. We responded through the appropriate channels, with the appropriate documentation, and the matter was resolved within 3 weeks in a way that required no further engagement from me. What I had accounted for and what I hadn't told Melissa yet was what I'd done with the proceeds from the Columbus house and with the funds released through the charitable trust restructuring. Dorothy had believed in education in the specific way that only people who'd been the first in their families to get one tend to believe in it. She'd grown up in rural Indiana, the daughter of a man who worked at a grain elevator and a woman who cleaned houses. She'd gotten a scholarship to Indiana State, and she'd become a high school chemistry teacher for 27 years. Every year, for the last decade of her life, she donated a portion of her salary to the county scholarship fund. Small amounts. But she'd done it without fail, and she'd never mentioned it to anyone except me. I established the Dorothy Elaine Kowalski Scholarship Fund named in full, her maiden name included, the way she'd signed letters to her own family at Indiana State University. The endowment was structured to provide annual merit scholarships for first-generation students from rural Indiana counties. Dennis helped me set it up properly. The university's development office was, to put it mildly, pleased. There was a brief ceremony. I didn't invite anyone. I sent Melissa the paperwork on a Sunday morning, about 6 weeks after I'd moved to Millbrook. No explanation. No cover letter. Just the documents and a photograph of the plaque they'd placed outside the scholarship office with her mother's full name on it. She called me 40 minutes after I knew she'd received the email. She didn't say anything for the first few seconds. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "Dad." Just that. And I said, "I know." She came to visit me in Millbrook the following weekend. We sat on the back porch of my rental, and I made the same coffee I'd been making for 40 years, too strong in the way Dorothy had always complained about, and we talked the way we used to talk before everything got complicated. She didn't defend Brandon. She didn't ask me to explain myself further. At one point, she looked out at the yard behind the rental and said, "Mom would have liked it here." I thought that was probably true. I won't tell you that everything resolved itself cleanly. Life at 63, I've found, doesn't tend toward clean resolutions. Brandon and Melissa are still married, though I understand from small things Melissa has said in the months since that their conversations have shifted in register. Whether that's temporary or permanent, I genuinely don't know. I don't ask. That's her life, and she's a grown woman who inherited her mother's ability to take measure of things accurately, even when the measurement is unwelcome. What I can tell you is this. On a Saturday in early October, I drove out to the Millbrook Public Library, where I've started volunteering on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I was helping a retired coal miner named Garrett work through a GED prep book. He's 58 years old. He told me on our third session that he'd always been ashamed of not finishing school, that he'd carried it around for 40 years like something heavy in a bag he couldn't put down. I told him that Dorothy had believed, genuinely believed, that it was never too late to put the bag down. He passed the math section on his second try. He shook my hand in the parking lot afterward, and I thought, not for the first time, that Dorothy was right. She was nearly always right. I just took longer than I should have to stop arguing with her about it. The rose stems I brought from the garden have rooted. I planted them along the south fence line in early spring. They're not much yet. 2 thin stalks, a handful of leaves. But they took. That's the part that matters. They took, and they're still here. And come next June, I expect they'll bloom. I check the scholarship fund page at the university sometimes, in the evenings. They've selected 2 recipients for the first year. I read their short biographies when the university sends them to me. One is studying nursing. One wants to be a civil engineer. I read about that one twice. I thought about what it would have meant to me at 18, to know that someone believed, without knowing me at all, that what I wanted to do with my life was worth investing in. I think that's what Dorothy was doing, all those years, with those small donations she never mentioned. Not changing the world, just putting her hand on the scale, quietly, in the direction of something that mattered. I'm trying to do the same. I talked to Melissa last Sunday. She's thinking about going back to school part-time for a degree she'd always put off. She asked me what I thought. I told her I thought it was long overdue and that I'd already looked up the application deadlines, just in case she asked. She laughed. It was her mother's laugh. I held on to the sound of it for the rest of the day. That's the whole story. Or as much of it as I can tell from where I'm standing. I don't have a tidy moral to tie it up with. What I have is a quieter life than the one I had before. A rental house with a south-facing fence, 2 rose stalks that took root in new soil, and the knowledge that Dorothy's name is on a building at Indiana State University, in full, the way she would have written it herself. I think she would have approved of most of what I did. The parts she wouldn't have approved of, she would have told me about directly, with that patient, sad look, until I figured out she was right. I'm still figuring things out, but I'm still here. And sometimes that's enough.